So it's George Herbert we're looking at, and George Herbert is a contemporary of John Donne. A little bit younger, an extraordinary man, famous for his rhetoric, his speaking ability. He was the orator for Cambridge University, which meant that he would read or deliver speeches in Latin on public occasions, representing the university. And the university is obviously a learning institution, but it has a sort of, it's part of the establishment, in the same way in our days that we find that institutions are embedded in the, even if they're not government, they're still connected in some way. So universities and the legal realm, and I talk about the people that wear the robes. So we see us process as academics, we got the robes on. The justices of the peace wear robes, and clergy wear robes. In the case of Cambridge and Oxford at the time, it's a bit of both, because to be to go to Cambridge or Oxford, you need to be a Christian, and you need to eventually be an Anglican, for that matter. Not the case right at this point, I don't think, when Herbert is there, but he is an Anglican. But he did extremely well in university, and as I say, was doing well for himself on a career path. So the university orator is a representative function, but you can expect him probably to go into some sort of government office and maybe serve in government in some capacity at the king's disposal. That's the trajectory he's on. So he will be a very powerful man at some stage. But he decides, rather than do that, to accept a small and insignificant position as a clergyman in the Anglican Church, a small parish. And he spends the rest of his life there. He dies at a very young age. I think he dies at 37. So he was a man that was, to some degree, made for the public arena. He had all the tools and the abilities that commended him to that. Remember, or you might not remember, but in rhetoric, oratory is something that you expect of politicians. Not that you would know that in our day, since these bumbling people can't speak usually. They and they awe, and they obfuscate, and they usually embarrass themselves. But there's an expectation that goes along with that, and there are many important figures historically who would have been trained in rhetoric, and Augustine was one of them. Before he also left that path, he was a teacher of rhetoric, to become a bishop. He was sort of compelled to do that. He didn't particularly choose to do that. He was called to fulfill that position. Less obvious coercion here. It was more of a sense of conscience. Not exactly sure, but he accepted that position. And then he is pretty much anonymous. We don't hear much about him. He becomes famous when his poems are published, and they're published after he's dead. So these poems that we're going to read, some of them, they're written in a collection called The Temple. And what's peculiar about them is that the titles of the poems are related to things related to a church. Christians don't anymore refer to their gathering place as a temple, although occasionally you get churches called temples. But in general, a temple, that's a Jewish institution, right? The temple is where sacrifices are made and so forth. But this body of poems is called The Temple, and there are all sorts of things associated with churches and life of churches and people in churches that are part of Herbert's collection of poems called The Temple. Let's see if I can throw some up here, and you'll see what I mean. What I'm going to do here. There you go. So that just to give you a sense on the title page. Can you see that? Is that big enough? But there's a church porch, and there's an altar and a sacrifice, thanksgiving, things that are either in a church or associated with it. There are church windows, there are sacraments, there's prayer and faith and affliction and sin and evensong and church floor and windows and all these things. So poems are associated with things that would have been in and around him for his whole time as a clergyman. And he wrote them for his own purposes, by and large. I'm not sure he distributed the poems. That he wrote them out more or less as devotionals. And when he knew that he was going to die, he left a note saying, if you think that any poor soul would benefit from these, by all means publish them, but otherwise dispose of them if you choose. I didn't write them for others, I wrote them for myself. And when they were published, they became wildly popular and have remained popular ever since. They were published in numerous editions, but he did not do it for his own fame. Although his fame now is associated with these poems, mostly. He was a very interesting man in that sense, very humble, and reflects a very much, I think, a product of the age in which he's writing, which is mainly a Puritan temper, I would say. They want a pure form of religion that pleases God. So it's written against the Catholic Church of the day and the belief widespread amongst the reformers that the church had gone off the rails in various ways and needed to be, its doctrine and its practices needed to be purified so that God would be pleased, given his due praise, etc. So Herbert, broadly speaking, was thrown into that movement, and I think you can see that in his poetry, that devotion to God, which is for him very much personal, and yet also is exemplary. So what poems did I say we would look at? There's so many that I like. Easter Wings. Yeah, I wanted to look at this one because it, there are two versions there. I hope this is the right one. Oh, because because it goes on to the next one. So Easter Wings, there are two parts here. And what you'll notice is that there's peculiar shape to this poem that looks like a wing. And there are two of them. Now, Easter, we know, is the day, I'll put that a little higher if you can't see it. Easter is the day associated with the resurrection of Jesus. And has associations of light and life and triumph and glory and so forth, but it's not to be separated from an event that happened 3 days earlier, namely Good Friday, in which the exact opposite connotations are present: death and darkness and defeat. And the two events are connected in the event of the cross. This poem's called Easter Wings. When you think of wings and associate it with Christianity, you think of angels. At least most people do. That's the immediate association. But probably more, connected to that, in terms of the portrait of wings in the Old Testament, I can only think of the mercy seat on the within the temple, on the tabernacle of God. There are two wings, two angels that are depicted on the cover of the this, and their wings are almost touching. And the presence of God is said to reside right between the space where the two wings almost touch. It's right there. It's not in the Ark of the Covenant, it's right above it and so forth, and on the mercy seat. All sorts of associations, they're symbolic and otherwise, because of course we associate God with mercy. And that whole cover of the Ark of the Covenant is called the mercy seat. So God is sitting on the mercy seat, and he reigns there. Now, in terms of Easter, the way Easter works is in terms of the great exchange. At Good Friday, the world sees one thing and Christian faith says another. At the cross, the world sees death and sin and judgment and affliction and weakness. Because remember, a man's crucified naked. Weakness and humiliation and shame. That's what the world can see there. Christian theology says, on the contrary, when we speak of the cross of Christ, which becomes the universal symbol of the Christian faith, we understand not death but life, and not sin but righteousness, and not shame but glory, and not weakness but strength, because Christ destroys sin and death at the cross, right? So there's all sorts of paradoxes connected with the cross of Christ that are also brought in to the event that follows it 3 days later, namely the resurrection, on which we call Easter. Herbert has all of those things in mind here when he writes this poem. Now, the poem, as I say, is written with a certain shape in mind that looks like a wing, or two wings, and there's going to be two pairs of wings. There's one that follows this, and I'll read it after it. But you'll note that in terms of the meter, that each line is one iamb shorter than the next. Now, an iamb is an unstressed and a stressed syllable. Lord, who createst man in wealth and store. That is, Lord, who createst man in wealth and store. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first one is elliptic. It drops the first syllable because of the comma. There's a pause there, so that takes up one of the lines. But that is an iambic pentameter, the first line. And the next line is iambic tetrameter. It's only 4 iambs. It's 4 syllables. And then it moves down to 3 and 2 and 1. So it keeps, the line shrinks ever more. And the length of the line and the abbreviation of the line becomes thematically significant as it goes as well. So there's a reflection between form and content. So the form, you can see it's a longer line that gets ever shorter, but so does the theme. He talks about it. And then when it gets to its utmost point of narrowness, smallness, then it starts to expand back out again. And he connects this theologically. And think about what I've just said about the cross, and how God loses everything there, and we gain everything. And that is what he's playing upon here. The loss of everything, which entails the gain of everything. The loss of everything for him, the gain of everything for us. It's called the great exchange. It's a very bad bargain for God. It's very good news for us. But I'll read it, and then you see how the way in which the lines depict this reflect the theology presented therein. Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor. With thee, O let me rise as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. I'll go on to the next one, which immediately follows. It's the second pair of wings. My tender age in sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame, thou didst so punish sin, that I became most thin. With thee let me combine, and feel this day thy victory, for if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. So we have two pairs of Easter wings, and the one comes on the back of the other. You'll note that in both cases, when it shrinks down, these lines are comparable. It goes down to a thinness, and then it expands with the two syllables, with thee. That's at the point. With God. So on our own, we shrink down to nothing. We have nothing which we bring to our own salvation, except our sin. And that's the tendency of what it does, is it whittles human life down to the point where there's nothing there. We're annihilated by our own existence because of sin. But with thee, with God, remember, thee is the personal, relational term. With God, then we expand back outwards. Now, he presents this in two ways, and he has two tries at it. The first one looks back historically and thinks about humanity in general. Not the particular man, George Herbert, but mankind, Lord, who created man in wealth and store. So man now, in the sense of Adam, including Adam and Eve and the whole human race. You created us all with plenitude, with all manner of blessings. Though foolishly he lost the same. What's referred to here? Original sin. The sin of Adam and Eve lost that original state of blessedness which took place in the Garden of Eden, which we call paradise. And the effect of that was an ever shortening span of human life. You know, in the beginning in Genesis, we read about people living hundreds and hundreds of years. And down to the point where in the Psalm, the breadth or the length of a man's years are 80 years and 10 as the standard expectation. By the way, your pension plan is pegged to that idea. You live to 65 and then you get 5 years and you die. You get 5 years of pension. That's what your pension plan is paying for. It's expecting that you're going to live 80 years and 10. That's where the number came from. So if you live to 80, you've outlived your allotted pension by 10 years. If you live to 90, and so there's not enough money in the pension plans, etc. Never mind. Get off topic there. That way we'll create all sorts of different anxieties and frustrations. Never mind. But that's why the retirement age is at 65, because you're going to live to the age of 70. Right? That's it. Nobody wants to retire at 65 now. Where the money going to come from to look after me when I'm old? Good question. But when the pension plan was set up with a biblical worldview in mind in the populace, we got to set it at some age, or you just work till you drop. So 5 years, there you go. And you might die earlier, you might die later, but roughly speaking, there you go. Or 80 if you're particularly strong. But in general, that's the expectation. Human life shrinks and becomes more and more reduced to the point where now that's pretty much the extent of human life. Until he became most poor. So he has nothing left of the original, or very little of what was originally considered to be a blessed human life. And it's not thinking only in terms of years and health here, it's considering all of the blessings that come with God. A righteous mind. Good social relations. An unimpeded relation with the animal world. With the environment. There's no consequences of sin. All of these are cumulative. It's lost in original sin, but it keeps on shrinking down to the point where he is most poor. But now, because of Easter, just think about that again. Think of the cross and how everything gets to the point where we look at the cross and all we see is the worst possible, worst imaginable state. That's the center of the Christian faith. Why do you have a cross around your neck? Seems rather morbid, at the least. Why not have a little cradle around your neck? You ever thought about that? Why not a little cradle? It's Christmas. A baby in a cradle. That's a little bit more positive. But it's the cross. Because the event of the cross is different. It reflects the paradox and the truths of the Christian faith most vividly. And that is that of ourselves we are most poor. But yet God, for our sakes, became poor. He became a man. So that's where he begins the expansion of this Easter wing. With thee, only at that point, with thee, oh, let me rise, just as you did, as larks. Harmoniously, a lark is a songbird, beautiful song. And it rises up, it sort of flutters in the air. There are certain birds whose wings flap and they don't go vertically, they seem to go, or they don't go horizontally, they go up vertically. They almost seem to just rise straight up. A lark can do that. and sing this day thy victories. Note, not his, but Christ's. Then, being with thee, shall the fall further the flight in me. Only then, with thee, not on my own. So there's the first take, and the first look at it, he presents it in a general form, as general terms as part of the human race. And so it may be referred to justification. We're justified by faith. We have life by placing our trust in Christ, who rose from the dead for our sins. He said he was going to die for our sins, and he did. Right? Crucified, buried, and rose again. Justification. The second is like it, and yet it's a little different. The structure is the same. But now it's more personal. So he begins with man. Now he talks about my tender age. The individual. Where he left off last time, he's very personal now. My tender age. Think of yourself as a young Christian. Maybe you are one. In sorrow did begin. Because here's the truth of the Christian life. You have life, eternal life. All of the benefits of Christ that are imputed to you by faith, you genuinely have, and yet you still live in a mortal body. And you are still afflicted by all manner of things. And the affliction is part of God's way of making you fit for heaven. You're given the promise of eternal life as soon as you have faith, but you're not yet ready to be there because your old habits are still there. They're kicking around. You still sin. You still have a depraved mind. You still think things that you ought not to think. You do things you ought not to do. You still don't make Christ the center of your life in all areas. And God uses affliction to pull you in the right direction, to show how all things, even the thing that we saw at the cross was the very worst thing, could still be used for God's glory. And he does this with individuals. This is what we call sanctification then. If that was justification, the first one, this one may be more a reference to sanctification. My tender age and sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame thou didst so punish sin that I became most thin. Remember, I said that Herbert died at 37. I didn't tell you that he had been sickly most of his life. Suffered terrible illness. Sickness, pain. And he saw these not as a curse, but as a sign that God loved him. He was doing something through the affliction. There was a purpose to it for him. And how did he know that God didn't regard suffering as something that contradicted him? Because we could see at the cross he had already used suffering and pain for a very particular purpose, a redemptive purpose, and one that he didn't just inflict on us. He himself took it on himself. Same in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's something about suffering for a Christian which is redemptive. I don't mean that theologically. I mean in the sense of it's pushing us along the road, the same road that Christ trod. That I became most thin through the sicknesses and the shame that were there to punish sin. But then he begins again, right like the last one, with thee. And it then moves out. So the same suffering, the same pain, but now he no longer, what has been got rid of at that point is the sin. Because the sin has been punished, and he's been changed by this. He starts praising God even though he's in prison, like Paul, or he's suffering from afflictions. He doesn't see it the way the world does. He sees it in a different light. Yes, sir.
Would you say his poems in some ways try to answer what John Donne was asking in some ways the last poem we're looking at?
Death be not proud?
In the Holy Sonnets, he very much focused on the themes of like pain and sickness and death. We talked about, and so like why is this happening to me? Like why do I have to go through these kinds of things? But then you have here Herbert. He's saying like
I found, so we, just a couple of classes ago, we looked at every man encountering death and an attitude towards death, which is really interesting. You know, do we have anything to learn from the Middle Ages? I think so, actually. It's an extraordinary thing. And here, and we'll find next semester, I'll look at Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich as well, and again, a man faces death and the days that lead up to his death as well, which were not good. I'll just, spoiler alert, he's in pain, and he's isolated, and he's in his room, etc. But he's reflecting on something that in our age you rarely hear. In fact, you almost never hear anybody talk about death, and never talk about it in anything other than, I don't want that to happen. I'm going to talk about it, but and we have hospitals, hospices, whatever, where people who go when they're sick, and they go there and we don't have to see them anymore. And so we don't see death or sickness all around us. And so I think one of the reasons the world went mad at COVID, because it did go mad, it's literally crazy in the response, was because people have been so insulated from sickness and death that the idea that it could, through a virus that you can't see, could afflict you. And you might even have it without symptoms. This is a crazy, like a terrifying thought. And in response to that, the response, let's do anything, we'll do anything, whatever, to stop that from happening. Highly immature response. It's extraordinary, irrational. As if there were no viruses before, right? And all of the health and safety precautions of the past were thrown out the window. You know, isolate yourselves when you're healthy. Extraordinary. Quarantine the healthy. It's in part because of an inability to face the possibility of death, because most people are able through a good diet and through medication and nutrition and through the hospitals to just get this out of my mind until it happens. And then when it happens, let's forget that it happened, let's not talk about that. And today they have celebrations of life to deal with it, rather than a funeral. So let me think happy thoughts all the time, happy thoughts, happy thoughts. Extraordinary. Herbert is aware of death because he himself is sick, and sickness is all around him in his day. And the pastors go to the sick when they are sick as a part of their vocation. They feel like they have a particular ministry to the sick and the dead and the dying. And they have things to say to them because they realize that this life is not the only life, and that what is most important is the relationship to the Lord of life. And they will live differently and they will die differently as a result of that. Our age, which has rejected that by and large, has no comforts anymore. It only has fear. So I think he is saying, and I do think he's saying something the same as done. He's answering the same sort of questions. He gives us answers that we need. I think we still need them. Yes, sir.
When we're looking at this call of the evil rings,
The
syllables.
yes.
That's important.
Yeah, I called it syllables because I have not taught scansion or meter here in first year English, but it is a meter, and it is a particular type of meter, and there are different ways of expressing meter, and if I'm fortunate, then it can fall into syllables, and it's unstressed and stressed. But there are other ways of presenting a metrical foot that go beyond syllables, unfortunately. But more or less, this is written in syllables, an unstressed and a stressed, because everyone knows what a syllable is, I think. Yeah, and you can see that here, and you can even see it on the page, but you can also count it and you can hear it. And there's a regularity, there's an unstressed, and then there's a stressed syllable. And the stresses on the syllables is consistent here. It falls on the second, right? Da-dun, 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 da-dun. And then it keeps getting shorter and shorter, and if you did it, it would be like it's getting faster and faster. Like the first line is da-dun, 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 and then it's da-dun, 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 and that da-dun, 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 and that da-dun, 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 da-dun. right? It's getting faster and faster and faster. And you can imagine your anxiety growing with the speed as things get shorter and briefer and thinner. And then you get to that point of absolute panic terror where there's nothing left, and with thee, and initially the with thee, it's a pretty cold comfort. You know it in your head, but do you feel it and live it out? Is it really something that you experience? Well, it is, actually, because God is alive, because he does give us his Spirit. He works through us, and then you do start to experience the fullness of that. I know people who come to faith and really have experienced it almost in miraculous terms, where they're just, like we see in Scripture, leaping and praising God, right? The lame stand. And people do still experience it that way. That wasn't the case for me. I wasn't on my sick bed. I wasn't blind. I wasn't lame. I wasn't deaf, right? I didn't have those manifestations, but I did have a sort of an intellectual awareness, and for me it was transformative. But a lot subtler than that. But still I could recognize it and the implications then, and that is what he's depicting here. But it's through suffering, no. It's not the suffering's gone, that was the first part, and now the suffering is gone. The suffering's still there, but the suffering now is seen differently. Oh, let me combine and feel this day thy victory. For if I imp my wing on thine, to imp a wing is to put you know how birds' feathers aren't just going side by side, but they overlap, so that the air doesn't get between the wings, right? So it's just basically airtight, and that's why they can, that's what imping is. And if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me, but the affliction never goes away. But now the affliction has the same purposes as it did with Christ. If I imp my wing on thine, and are with thee, and then I will feel thy victory. I won't just know it, I will feel it. It's an extraordinary poem. Here we have Christian theology fused with classical poetics by a man who is a classically trained orator, using it to advance doctrine that I hold to and love. I think this is wonderful. Any other comments or questions about this? I want to move on to other poems as well.
Just wondering, in terms of word structure, how many there are, so further on, but when do we use certain structures in terms of when we're trying to express something specifically, are there certain parameters, meters?
Yes, there are. There are certain meters that are associated with certain poetic forms. Yeah, this one called an I am, which is a short stress and a long stress, or an unstressed and a stressed, is the natural rhythm for the English language. So Shakespeare writes his drama in iambic pentameter. It's 5 I ams, 5 feet, and it's an unstressed and stressed 5 times. It sounds closest to the way people speak, and yet it has a metrical lilt to it. And that was the first line is that, and then it goes down and so forth. But yes, you get, and in general, poetry tends to be in the longer meters. It's either pentameter, or 6 lines hexameter, or quadrameter if it's just 4. But it tends not to be shorter than that. It can be. And the effect of that, and then it can be unstressed to stressed, or it can flip it around and be the other way. It can start stressed and go unstressed. And the effect of it is like the musical equivalent, if you know anything about music, is playing something in the major key or in the minor key. Minor key sounds sad and somber. Same thing, it can be affected through poetry. Most of your hymns, by the way, are iambic tetrameter. It's got 4, just like the second line, and still with sicknesses and shame. That's tetrameter. There are 4 stresses there. Most of the hymns that you sing in the English language are that. It fits a song more. Whereas a pentameter, an extra foot, is more like speech. The meter is the same, just the length, line length. And you will find that good songwriters are aware of the effect of line length on the audience, and you can marry the meter with the whether it's a major or minor key, and the effect, you can enhance that. So not only do you have the meter now and the emphasis, but now you have the minor key to further emphasize a sense of sorrow or whatever, and then you can flip it over to a major key to make it harmonious, right? And here you might do that, begin in a minor key and then flip it and over to a major key, and it sounds suddenly more positive and cheerful. Yes?
It's even cool if some of the bigger hymnals still actually have certain songs that have the same meter that you can then take the words of one to put into the music of another because the meters are the same.
I can do that just by talking. I can take a musical structure and I can create words that will go with that. Like once you get it in your head. But yes, see, they play the same songs over and over and they just put new words to it. And what that allows is the audience immediately knows how to sing it. It's memorable. And sometimes they even associate it, it's so strongly memorable and so joyous that they immediately think of the other song when they're singing this song. Right? And so there's an allusion to that other song just by the musical score that goes with that. It's extraordinary. Yeah, so there are many, many ways you can play with that. And poetry then starts to do that. And yes, it's brilliant. But I'm not here to teach you about hymnody or about meter. But that comes out of English literature. But that then gets very specific, and I'm not even, this is first year English, you're not even English majors. Some people might, your eyes might cross at this point. They shouldn't, but it happens. Well, I'm glad you think so. I think it's cool myself. This one's called Easter Wings. The next one, what was it called? Was it prayer? No. Prayer. Yes, prayer. Okay, so let's look at prayer, and there's more than one prayer, so I hope I get the right one here. Yeah, this one. This one is, it's a catalog, is one way to describe it. It's also written in the form of a sonnet. Sonnets are, yeah. And are usually, at least originally, associated with the age of Petrarch and the Renaissance and are devoted to love. Right? A love of man for a woman. He writes a sonnet to her about how beautiful she is and how her eyes are like shining like stars, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a sort of conventions that go with that. But once those conventions get established, then it's sort of like what you were just talking about with using a song with certain associations, and then I'll just put other words in that song. And we still have the expectations there in the back of our minds, but now we can see that the artist is pushing those towards another purpose, and that's what he does here. We expect a love song here, and it's about prayer. What is prayer? That's what the poem's about. And he comes up with a whole catalog of different associations with prayer, and some of them are totally contradictory, by the way. Some of them are good, and some of them, not so good. Just think of and listen to some people's prayers sometimes. And you think, you can't say that. That's blasphemous. And it probably is, by the way. The person prayer, oh my goodness. Lord, don't grant that prayer. I'm not going to say amen to the end of that prayer. Oh, what do you mean? Anyway, prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet, sounding heaven and earth. A plummet is something that you sound the depths with. It's got a lead weight on the end of a piece of string. How deep is it? This many fathoms deep. Engine against the Almighty, sinners tower, reversed thunder, Christ side-piercing spear, the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. Give me a definition of prayer. He's just given you a whole list of definitions of prayer. They aren't definitions so much as associations. And sometimes there are associations, there are observations he's making about things that people call prayers. What are the things that are called prayers, which we would blanch or blush to call prayers? Well, these are in the second quatrain. An engine against the Almighty, an engine, he's thinking like a cannon. So it's a prayer. I'm blasting God. I'm blaming God. I'm angry at God in my thoughts, in my words, for something that's going on in life. It's a sinner's tower. I'm proud in my tower. I'm thinking that I'm right, and God, you're wrong. Reversed thunder. Thunder comes from above, and then the lightning that goes down with it. Well, now I'm the thundercloud. Watch out, I'm Thor. Clap, thunderclap. Upwards. Christ's side-piercing spear. How many people in their words have said things that are so filled with sin in their thoughts that really these are the very reasons that Christ died for you? Done in his name, even in the words of prayer. It happens. So he's describing and he's confessing. And then he switches, and the switches is, boy, is quite as a switch like almost no other. The 6 days world transposing in an hour. You know what transposition is? Is you transpose something from one key into another key. And that's what he's just done here. The whole of creation done in an hour. That's what's happening when you pray. Think about that. The whole world, God took 6 days to create the world. When you pray, you're in the counsel of God himself, and you are leaning into his creative power in the hour in which you're on your knees. A kind of tune which all things hear and fear. Softness with it. The bird of paradise, Dunn would have heard about these. Have you ever seen a bird of paradise? You ever seen the David Attenborough, the specials on the bird of paradise? Craziest birds you've ever seen in your life. Like there are thousands of different types of them, and they're beautiful, and they all look different, and they do the craziest things you've ever seen. You haven't seen the birds of paradise? No? Yeah, okay, give me 2 seconds here. I wonder if I bet you I can find it. This is sort of inappropriate for an English class, but whatever, it's not. There we go. No, I just skipped it.
Separated in very unbird-like shapes.
Look at this crazy thing.
Each male bird of paradise has a unique display for attracting mates. And none is more extraordinary than the one that takes place on this stage. We learn first. Every morning he clears his court of the night's fallen debris. It's a vital chore. His obsessive housework pays off, and a female drops in for a closer look. Now is his chance to really impress, but it won't be easy. Females are very fussy, and she'll expect his care. So far, so good. He has all the moves. Fancy footwork. The whirling dervish. The head poo shuffle with spin.
Anyway, enough of this. Otherwise I'll be...
Feathers and proof.
That's a bird of paradise. Now, he heard about these. Herbert, this is early 17th century. These are to be found in Indonesia, the sort of that South Pacific. he heard reports about the glorious colors and wonders of these creatures that God has made, and what can explain these crazy things. And he said, now you've seen something of it. That's that hilarious video. These are birds, and there are thousands of different, and they all have different behaviors. They look different, they have a mating ritual, all this sort of stuff. Extraordinary. He talks about this in relation to prayer. There's something of wonder, of marvel about it that doesn't seem, what's the use of this? The Milky Way, he does know. You can see that by looking up the stars. But church bells, beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, so the very life of a person's life. The land of spices, again, the Far East. You have to trade to get this and to get the wonderful flavors. I grew up in Canada when there was no spices in any food. Salad was lettuce, tomato, and cucumber. That was a salad. And then there's nothing else. You look on the shelves and, oh, yeah, we've got lettuce. What sort of lettuce? Lettuce. Oh, you mean iceberg lettuce? Oh, yeah. Well, that's lettuce. And now I get all the, the other fancy lettuce. Okay, whatever. And everything's spice. Okay, and the world comes to Canada. Okay. But that's the land of spices. That's the world that's spicy. Their tastes, their riches, and fragrances. And oh, wow. So it's a world, a whole different world. But the last phrase, something understood. Like whatever else, he can't explain it. That the understated conclusion. Brilliant. But note that it's about prayer, but it is a sonnet. Concludes with the rhyming couplet.
What is the starting lines for?
So these three are the four quatrains. They're called quatrains. There are 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet. 3 lines of 4. This is what we would call a Shakespearean sonnet. Although he separates the lines and gives a gap between them, he doesn't need to do that. But so there's the Petrarchan sonnet, which is an octave and a sestet, 8 and 6. Shakespeare breaks it down and makes it a little bit more, gives it a bit more variation. So there are 3 movements: first quatrain, second quatrain, third quatrain, and then a rhyming couplet at the end. And Shakespeare is a contemporary of Donne. And they would have known Shakespeare. Shakespeare was more famous for his sonnets than his plays. Not now, but. So let me go on to the next. The caller. Okay, do I want to do the caller? Okay, well, we'll see. The caller is completely different. Do I want to do the caller? No, I'm not going to do the caller. I'm going to do Christmas? No, it's too long. Virtue. Well, I know I'm going to do virtue, yes. So I will stick that there. It said I will find it. Affliction. No, what's it called? The caller. Where's the caller?
You could do Control F.
Control F, are you asking me to be intelligent?
But you can Control F and then you can search for the title.
Whoa. And I did?
Yep.
Caller, there. Da-da, and there's Love 3. Did I ever see Love 3? No, I might have to come after. Anyway, we'll go with this for now. The caller. So this is a reference to something that you might not be familiar with, because most of us are not from circles where the clergymen wear a collar. A collar, he's an Anglican, they wear what they call a dog's collar. And that means the little thing, the white choky thing that leaves a little slit in the middle so that it's white here, and then they call that a dog's collar. I think it's a little tongue-in-cheek, very British. The collar. He's wearing the clerical collars. He feels a vocation to be a pastor. I told you he left his earthly life. And as far as we know, he did it gladly. But there are days, I suspect, and this will reflect one of them, where he was not very happy. I struck the board and cried, "No more! I will abroad." What? Shall I ever sigh in pain? Remember the Easter wings, the affliction and so forth? Here he just sees suffering. My lines and life are free. Free as the road, loose as the wind, as large as store. Shall I be still in suit? Have I no harvest but a thorn, to let me blood and not restore what I have lost with cordial fruit? Sure, there was wine before my sighs did dry it. There was corn before my tears did drown it. By the way, I think this is like a speech. You can imagine an orator standing here. This is why I'm speaking this way. I think he is giving a speech. Who's listening to the speech? I don't know, but he's railing. There was wine before my sighs did dry. There was corn before my tears did drown it. Is the year only lost to me? Have I no bays to crown it? No flowers, no garlands gay, all blasted, all wasted? Not so, my heart. But there is fruit, and thou hast hands. Recover all thy sigh-blown age on double pleasures. Leave thy cold dispute of what is fit, and not forsake thy cage. Thy rope of sands, which petty thoughts have made, and made to thee good cable to enforce and draw and be thy law, while thou didst wink and wouldst not see. Away, take heed. So there's different passages here, and it's a voice talking to himself. It's what C.S. Lewis calls the voluble self. You know when you're talking to yourself. He's talking to himself. Well, who else is he talking to? Easy. It's not quite Smeagol and Gollum. It's not quite good cop, bad cop, but there's a voice inside his head. One of them is, I've had enough. Right? And it's just railing, and then there's a voice inside him, hold on a second here. Trying to reason with that voice. And then the voice comes back again, and then again in response to this, away. Enough. Take heed. I will abroad. That's where he began. Call in thy death's head there. Tie up thy fears. He that forbears to suit and serve his need deserves his load. So all these are dialogue. It's dramatic. There's a speaker speaking to whom? Speaking to himself. But he is angry at himself. He's just really angry. And now he stands outside of himself and talks from the outside. But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methoughts I heard one calling, child. And I replied, my Lord? So the only voice he hears up to this point is himself, and himself angry, and himself trying to console himself, persuade himself. He's not persuaded. And now the moment has passed, and he hears a voice. And the voice is not his voice. It's very much of a modern poem, this one. Because it's not very, the form is very free. Before this we saw one in which it was a shape poem, very clearly structured. And the next one was a sonnet, very clearly structured. This one's very free form. It's like somebody talking. And it's short, it's long, and there's no apparent structure. It's random, it's going all over the place. Other than that there's voices coming in. It's a bit like a song, often. More like what we today call a stream of consciousness, a bit like that. But it's more voices talking. And in the end, he hears another voice. Again, I find it fascinating that a man like Herbert could have so many different types of poems under the same umbrella of the temple. I'll just leave this off as it is. Now, virtue. Is virtue one of the poems that I actually chose? I don't know if I did. Oh, it is. Okay, I love this poem. You know what virtue is? No, you don't. What is virtue? Sorry? Your goodness? Yes, different ways of describing types of goodness. So, like in the classical world, remember we looked at in purgatory, the 4 virtues that were represented by, so there was courage and wisdom and, yes?
Would it be like an intrinsic motivation to act in accordance with morals?
Sure. I don't know if it'd be intrinsic or not, but it could be. Yeah, it's from you. It's part of your character. We associate virtue with character. It's often associated with sexual relate, but there's no, that's just that's unnecessary. It can be much broader than that. That's part of it, but it's not the whole of it. And it's not the whole of it here. Here it's more broadly defined. And properly speaking, virtue is that which suits a man. And a man is a vir in Latin, vir. So it's manliness. Women can have manliness in the sense of virtue, right? Because it's not meant as a masculine thing. It's more as this fits a human being. Virtue, the virtue of something. It can also be the power, the potency. But you're going to love this poem, I think. I love this poem. I'm going to read the whole thing. What I want you to note is how he picks up certain words from one stanza, and they're quatrains, 3 quatrains, 4 quatrains, and then moves to the next one. And the sense of death is there throughout again. And each stanza also plays on the word sweet. Sweet and death. Sweetness and death. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky. The dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. Sweet rose, whose hue, angry and brave, bids the rash gazer wipe his eye. Thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie. My music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives. But though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. So you can see the manifold ways in which sweetness is picked up, and also of death is picked up, and the way it starts to it isn't just that it plays on different senses, it builds on them. So the third is the composite or the accumulation or the collection of the first 2, the day and the rose, because the sweet spring in the third stanza is full of days and roses. So the first one was about a day, the second about a rose, the third about days and roses. So he builds on this, and it builds to a climax. But there's a twist in that, an unexpected outcome to all of this. But let's talk about the sweetness of the day. Sweetness in the sense of it's not too hot. It's just pleasant. Conducive to temperate life. We talk about temperate climate, and so forth. As opposed to our climate, the Arctic or the tropical, which is too hot. But temperate, it's not too hot, it's not too cold. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky. The dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. He's talking about a day in a metaphorical term. A day has a life and then it has a death. Every day dies. At the end of the day is over. And at the end of the day, then there's dew left on the ground from the humidity, right? And so he's, again, imagining that the earth is weeping at the death of the day. You ever in the summer, when it doesn't happen in the winter here. In the winter, we get frost on the grass. In the summer, we get dew on the grass. You get up in the morning, there's water on it. It's like the morning of the day. Imagining it in these sense, but associating it with something that is to be lamented at the loss. Then the sweet rose, whose hue, angry and brave. I mean, roses are all sorts of different colors, but we tend to associate roses with red roses, and you tend to associate a beautiful perfume as well. And when you see a rose, you want to grab it. And of course, if you do that, then you're going to find that you wish you hadn't, because it has very sharp thorns, in reference to that here, of course. Sweet rose whose hue angry and brave bids the rash gazer wipe his eye. Before there was weeping, the first, he still picked up weeping, but from a different association. Now I've been pricked by the thorn. But now think about the rose also in terms of death. Thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Note in both cases, the thing that is referred to is personified and personalized, and thou. The day is made into a thou, a person, and so is the rose. There's an intimacy. Now the two together. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie. Do you know what he's meant by sweets here? We don't use this in Canadian English, but it's British English. Sweets are chocolates, candies, sweets. Let's call them sweets. A box of sweets. They're chocolates are in. But the two together, all of them together, and they're compacted in a box. Think of like a coffin, because they all go into the ground. My music shows you have your closes. Closes. Have anyone played the flute or any sort of the wind instruments, the stops? That's what. My music shows you have your closes. Why? Because the day and the wood, and the flute is made out of wood, and the music that's made from the dead wood transposes the deadness into something beautiful and life-giving, namely the music. My music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Yes. So having associated with music and the stops also, think of the stop of sound, but also stop in the sense of the end of life. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives. I used to work in a lumberyard, build-all type thing. And when you get boards, and if you haven't seasoned them, they warp, seriously warp. You know what I'm talking about? You've seen this with green timber, and you leave it, and it just bends like a hockey stick. And so you have to let it sit for a while, and until it dries out. And if you dry it and you keep it and you put it together, so first of all you cut the tree, and then you cut it into the right length and so forth, and then you pack it together so that it dries alongside, and you hold it until it's totally dried out, and then it's straight and flat. And that's then seasoned timber at that point only, and at that point you can use it. You can use it before then as well, but then you just hammer it in so that it doesn't bend all over the place. But it's going to otherwise. But a sweet and virtuous soul is like something that has suffered death and makes a music. Only a sweet and virtuous soul like seasoned timber never gives. It's solid. It doesn't creak, doesn't warp. It's straight. But though the whole world turn to coal, that is die, then chiefly lives. So again, he's talking about suffering and virtue in the face of suffering and remaining straight and true. We talk about that with a board, how straight is it? Well, it's true. You can look along the line of it. I used to sell the wood to contractors, and that they pick up the board and they'd look and say, can I use this? Yeah. Some of them are, okay, sure. There's a bit of a bend to it, but I can work with that. Sometimes you can't, because it doesn't bend in one direction, it bends in two. You can't do that. So don't give me that. I'll have that stuff. But here, the purpose of virtue is to make you manly. Well, what's the manly? It's to live in the light of suffering so that God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick, and you're the crooked stick. It was Luther that said that, actually, that God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. He can do good things with bad people. Your preacher is a sinner. He can still point you to Christ. you're a parent, you're a sinner. You can still do something good with your children. And they're going to see all your sins. Right? But here's talking about how suffering and death still in a person can make sweet, beautiful, perfect music, even though everything is turned to coal. And then chiefly lives. So that's the virtue. It's in a sense the same sense that he had in Easter Wings. What's the final one I want? I think it was Love 3. Yes. I have 5 minutes. Oh, find it. I find it. Okay, forget it. Do it this way. That'll work. Yep, that works. There we go. Jesus is love divine. We need to think of that when thinking about this poem. Love is personified. The context is communion, Eucharist, however you want to describe it. And you are being bid to the communion table to eat the bread and drink the wine, the body and blood of Christ. When I don't know what your church practices here, but there's a call to the table to partake of this, just like in the Last Supper. Take, eat, this is my body, drink, this is my blood, given for you. Same sense here, but now it is God, Christ, doing the speaking. Love bade me welcome. Now this is, remember Herbert writing this, love bade me welcome. I mean, he's the pastor. He's the one who's inviting others. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Again, it's a dialogue. It's a dialogue now with Christ. It's the minister, the vicar, the pastor, aware of his own sinful unworthiness to receive the body and blood of Christ. Because I hear voices in it and you're wondering who's speaking. Because there's love and then there's I. There's my soul, there's love. Love is personified. But you're saying, how do I know? Because there's no speech marks, there's no quotations. Because I've done the poem 1,000 times is one reason. But for us, yeah. Well, there are clearly at least two speakers here. Otherwise, the first line, you're sort of flummoxed by it. Like, love bade me welcome. What is that? Normally, that doesn't mean much. So love must be someone, something. Love normally we think is an abstraction, as a thing. But here it seems personified. So even if it's an abstraction, it's personified. So love bade me. So there's love and there's me. Okay, and he bade me welcome. Now what happens then from that? Yet my soul drew back from love. Guilty of dust and sin. Here's the reason why. And then love, in response to that, but quick-eyed love, observing me grew slack from my first entrance and drew near to me, sweetly questioning. Where's the dialogue? Right there. He's questioning if I lacked anything. Now it's reported speech. We're not given the word, but that's the summary of what was said. Why are you pulling back? Something wrong? You need something? A guest, I answered. So no quotation marks, but a clear response to the questioning. No? A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, So the I answered, the I said, those are signs of speech. But he hasn't put the quotation marks, and it might just because it's on the internet. But even without that, you can still see that it's speech because of the I said, I answered, and so forth, right? I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. And then in response, love took my hand and smiling did reply. Again, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love. So again, the says love, love said, whatever, these are all indications of a dialogue going back and forth. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. So if you are the Lord, I will serve you. Well, this is just like the disciples saying, you're not going to wash my feet. I'm going to wash yours. Of course. He says, no, unless you let me wash your feet, you're not my disciples at all. My sacrifice, I will be your servant. You have to understand that the one who comes as your master is your servant. And how will I show that? Again, point to the cross. And that's the point here, though, as well. Oh, okay, well, if you're the Lord, now I understand who I'm speaking to. Well, then I'm going to serve you. Let me do the serving. Oh, no, you will sit down and taste my meat. Okay, and then I stop my arguing. Note that there's what I said, the voluble self, the argumentative. And again, because of a sense of guilt pushes us into thinking and misunderstanding the relationship, the terms that we come to Christ. Knowing our own sin, we're twisted out of shape, all bent out of shape. And that's how he calls us to come. Yes, you're bent out of shape. And I came for people bent out of shape. Bent so far that they were twisted and turned around the other way. But come and eat. It's a command. Communion is a command, by the way. Take, eat. This is my body. It's imperative. Right? You have to examine yourself, but still, command. That's it. Finish the course for the semester at any rate. We're in the middle of the Puritan period. We will pick up next semester in the Puritan period as well with the great John Milton and his Paradise Lost, another great epic. We've already done epics last semester. We'll do it again next semester, but it will be a Christian epic, and it will begin in the beginning, in Genesis. And so the subject matter will be the fall of mankind, Adam and Eve, original sin, so forth. But we'll do that next semester. I suggest that you read that work in the interim over the Christmas, at least get going on it, and you'll find that you have time. And I would recommend that you read it out loud to yourself because you will find that it is easier to follow then. You don't have to read it multiple times, I think you will get into it after a while. It takes time. But that's it until next class.